Breaking news out of the Middle East as Israel carried out a drone strike last night in Beirut, Lebanon, to assassinate senior Hamas leader Salah al-Aruri. Let's take a look at the aftermath of that attack. Muslim paramilitary group Hezbollah had previously vowed to enact huge consequences if Israel took military actions within Lebanon's borders. In a statement released following the assassination, Hezbollah said it considers the attack a dangerous attack on Lebanon, its people, its security, its sovereignty, and its resistance. It confirms that it will not go unanswered and unpunished, and that, quote, this significant day will be followed by more important ones. So beautiful patience and beautiful patience.
The assassination has had a ripple effect on the current war between Israel and Hamas. The Jerusalem Post reports that hostage negotiations between Hamas terrorists and Israel have been frozen while Israel remains on high alert for potential Hezbollah reprisals. Here now to discuss further is Dr. Trita Parsi, Executive Vice President at the Quincy Institute, and retired Lieutenant Colonel Geoffrey, former senior advisor to the U.S. military, and George R. Killam Jr., Chair of Criminal Law at Texas Tech University School of Law. Lieutenant Colonel, I'll start with you. How important a military objective was this, taking out this leader, and does this increase the risk of further terrorism against Israel or even the United States?
Well, I think the second point is more of a strategic policy question, not so much a legal question, but I think obviously conducting this attack in Beirut will increase the likelihood of confrontation between Hezbollah and Israel on the northern border. In terms of the value of the target, that requires a certain degree of speculation. We were not involved in the decision-making process, but we do know from public reporting that this was a senior Hamas military operative. In fact, I would suggest that even the lead-in where we characterize this as an assassination is a little bit misleading. An assassination suggests that this was not a lawful object of attack under the international laws of war or international humanitarian law. If it was a senior military leader, then he was a legitimate military target. Then the question would become, was the attack conducted in accordance with the rules of war? And then there's the secondary issue of the relationship between Israel and Lebanon and the justification for violating Lebanese sovereignty as a result of conducting an attack in their territory. But in terms of the value of the target, I don't think Israel would have conducted this attack in this context unless they were satisfied that the value of the target was quite significant.
Dr. Parsi, I'd like to get you to weigh in on that. How typical is this sort of a drone strike operation into another country that Israel's not technically at war with formally? Is it appropriate to make the analogy that some people have made? This is akin to, let's say, Mexico having legitimate military target in Texas and doing a drone strike on a building there to kill that target.
Well, this didn't used to be an accepted norm, accepted conduct, but following the global war on terror and the Bush administration's expansion of what could be justified as the use of force, we've seen more and more countries use that specific defense in order to be able to conduct attacks of this kind. We see how the Turks are using it in Syria, the Russians use it in Ukraine, Iran has used it when it is targeted what it claims to be Israeli assets in Iraq. But the Israelis have a longer history of doing this long before this started to become a norm that the United States believed was a legitimate one. Now, whether this is successful or not in a strategic sense is a completely different question, because Israel has been conducting these type of assassinations or killings for quite some time, and without having any significant impact on the strategic trajectory of its conflict with its neighbors or various groups. On the contrary, what we have seen is a trend in which most of these military personnel that have been taken out by the Israelis have been replaced by more radical ones, and the conflict has only intensified.
Well, Dr. Parsi, if, as some would say, I think if Hezbollah is harboring or protecting terrorists who were involved in the planning of October 7th senior leadership, then what is Israel to ask nicely to turn them over? Obviously, that wouldn't work, giving them no choice to take this kind of action.
Well, I think at this point it's really not so much about the legality of this or not. I think the more pressing issue is that will this spark a much wider escalation that will widen the war, something that the Israelis have increasingly said that they are preferring. They've issued warnings to Hezbollah to move to the Litani River and claim that they would attack Lebanon if they don't. So, and if that war would then expand into also dragging the U.S. into it. So I think that is the most pressing issue right now, because we have seen over the course of the 10 or so plus weeks that this war has been going on, that we are inching closer and closer to an escalation that would bring in more actors into the war and potentially bring the U.S. into that war as well. Israel knew very well what it was doing, and he knew very well that this was a step that likely could escalate matters into that war.
Mr. Korn, is that a concern of yours, that this type of attack will lead to an escalation that will ultimately bring the U.S. more pointedly into the conflict?
Well, look, let's be clear. There's already ongoing hostilities on the northern border of Israel between Hezbollah and Israeli forces. Hezbollah has been routinely launching rockets and anti-tank missiles across the border, and there have been retaliatory strikes by the Israeli Defense Forces. Whether or not this will result in an escalation with Hezbollah, I think it's very difficult to assess. I mean, in some ways, you can see this as signaling to Hezbollah Israel's willingness and readiness to take action in Lebanon against senior leaders it believes are responsible for conducting aggression against the state of Israel. And let's not also forget that the very presence of Hezbollah military capabilities in southern Lebanon is in direct violation of a UN Security Council resolution, and Lebanon ostensibly has an obligation to prevent the use of that territory for military purposes. That area was supposed to be demilitarized and never was. When the Israelis withdrew, the vacuum was filled by Hezbollah. So there are a lot of complexities here, but I would agree with my fellow panelists that every action in this conflict, of course, creates risk of unintended consequences and escalation. That's the nature of conflict itself. Policymakers and national security advisors and leaders have to make complicated assessments of cost, benefit, risk, reward, and it's very difficult. But your colleague made the point. I mean, Israel is in a very difficult position. They identify a senior leader being given refuge in Beirut. They have the opportunity to conduct an attack against him. And they have been doing this for a long time. In international law, this is known as the unable or unwilling doctrine. And the United States is an advocate of this doctrine. This is the same theory the United States used when it conducted the raid in Abbottabad that killed Osama bin Laden. So there are many examples, as my fellow panelists indicated, of states exercising the right of self-defense in the territory of another state when it determines it's unable or unwilling to prevent the use of its territory by its enemy. But it is a complicated strategic policy issue for sure.
Dr. Parsi, does the targeted nature of the attack in Beirut give rise to the implication that the mass destruction in Gaza, in which over 20,000 people have now been killed, is not collateral damage that had to happen?
I think to claim that 20,000 or 22,000 at this point are legitimate collateral damage is simply not something that is compatible with international law. We're seeing now how the South Africans have raised a claim with the International Criminal Court, Court of Justice, to accusing Israel of deliberately engaging in genocide. If you read that brief, it is filled with extensive details in which the intent of genocide is made clear by Israeli officials themselves from the very beginning of this conflict through their own statements. It's going to be very interesting to see where that goes. And if it is approved, it's also going to have significant implications for the United States, mindful of the Biden administration's active facilitation of what is taking place in Gaza, particularly the slaughter that is taking place, mindful of the fact that the massive amount of weapons that the United States has provided Israel with since October 7th that has been used to kill these people in Gaza. So, and again, I think the thing that I'm most concerned about is the rather nonchalant way that the Biden administration is treating this risk of an escalation that can drag the U.S. into it. Regardless of what one thinks about what Israel is doing in Gaza, etc., I think my views are quite clear on this. I am perplexed by the administration's nonchalance when it comes to how this is risking bringing the U.S. into the war. We know for a fact now that during the 6 days that there was a ceasefire, there were no attacks by Iraqi militias and Syrian militias against U.S. troops. Just the day before, there were 6 of them. We know that the attacks by the Houthis dramatically reduced as well. We know that through a ceasefire, we can get the type of de-escalation that also dramatically reduces the attacks on the U.S. troops there and reduces the risk of the U.S. getting dragged into war. Yet that seems to be the measure that the Biden administration is least inclined to pursue.
Dr. Parsi, Lieutenant Colonel Quinn, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.